Rev up your engines!
Well, here's another reason not to buy an electric car. Turns out, at the end of 2022, it was actually more expensive in some places to refuel an electric car with electricity than it was to pump gas into a gasoline car. Now, for the first time in more than a year, owners of traditional gas-powered cars are paying less for the gasoline to fill it up than people were with electric cars. Because the price of gasoline came down and the price of electricity went up. Now, generally, what you find here is the price of gasoline fluctuates madly. Who knows what's behind that? They give you all kinds of reasons. Most of it is baloney. They're just because there's greedy oil companies. Price of electricity generally just continues to keep going up. It pretty much goes up most of the time. And of course, if people do start driving a bunch of electric cars, they'll have to start taxing it for road tax. It'll go up even higher. And it's like the infrastructure that would be needed for electric cars, for millions of them, would cost a fortune to build up the infrastructure. Therefore, the price of the electricity would get even higher. If you think it's high now, it'll get even higher if everybody starts driving electric cars. The Anderson Economic Group studied it and found out that, yes, it was actually costing more to put electricity in your car than gasoline at the end of 2022. Now, this includes stuff like the cost of driving. Charging stations aren't all over the place. You got to kind of go out of your way. But, interestingly enough, it did not include something that I would really include, and that is your time, right? Time is precious. If you got to sit there for an hour or more because you're waiting for other people to charge it up, that's money you've lost. And a lot of times, the money you lost, if you think of how much you make an hour, especially if you're a professional person, you're losing money sitting there for an hour, 2 hours if you have to wait, or 3 hours if there's more people in front of you and you got to wait to get in line to charge your car. They're not even including the time, which they should include because that's a big thing. Your time is worth money, right? Say you lose 2-3 hours of your time, 5 minutes from it with gas. Well, hey, let's say you make $60 an hour. Well, you're really losing out then waiting to get electricity. They don't even count that. KJC says, I have the code P0112. It keeps coming back. I've changed a whole bunch of intake air temperature sensors and nothing works. Well, that code is for the intake air temperature sensor, and you keep changing and nothing goes. But he also says I got a 12 volt instead of 5 volt reference on this. You're getting 12 volts to that sensor. It's supposed to be 5. It's a 5 volt reference. Odds are you got a problem in your main computer. And that's why it keeps tripping the code. The sensor is based on 5 volts. If it's getting 12, that means the computer is sending it 12 instead of 5. And the only reason I can ever see that happen is that there's a short somewhere in the computer. Because the computer's supposed to be able to throw out 5 volts, and it's throwing out 12. So somehow there's a problem in the computer that it's not sending 5 volts to it, but it's sending 12 volts instead. From my experience, and it isn't a Zuzu, they often have computer problems. You're probably going to need a computer. But before you do any of that, check the wiring with a fine-tooth comb, because a lot of times you'll get a wiring short, then that shorts out the computer. And if you replace that expensive computer and have it reprogrammed and find out there's a wiring short and it ruined the new computer, you will have wasted a lot of money on something. You need a good electrical mechanic to check that out first before you just go and buy a computer, because if it's being shorted out, you don't fix that short, you put a new computer and it'll ruin the new one too. Now the Mechanic 94 says, I have a cylinder 4 misfire on my Buick. Changed the coils, plugs. It still shows number 4. Took it to a mechanic, and he said, the valve on my cylinder's bad. How does he know? It does make sense. That's what will happen. You'll get a misfire if you got a bad valve. It's a very easy thing to test. All you have to do is have a wet and dry compression test done on the engine. You take out the spark plugs. You get a compression tester. You test them dry. You don't do anything except put the gauge in, crank it over, and test all 4. It's a 4-cylinder. You put a teaspoon of oil in the cylinder. Number 1, do a compression test. That's the wet one. Do that for all 4. If you find the compression in cylinder number 4, the one that's misfiring, is low, you got a problem. But you don't know what the problem is. If it's low when it's dry and you put a little oil in and it doesn't change hardly at all, it'll go up a tiny bit usually because the oil seals the rings a little bit better. If it still stays pretty low, that means that it's the valve, because the oil won't seal the valve. It means you got a problem with the valve. If the compression goes up a whole bunch, that means it's piston rings. So you could have a problem in that cylinder as a piston ring problem or a valve problem. I mean, that's how we mechanics tell. If the pressure goes up when you put oil in it, the oil will seal the piston rings. But the valves are on the top, and the oil doesn't affect that, and they're metal to metal. And if it's leaking there, you put oil in, it's still going to leak, and you'll have the lower pressure, even with the wet test. The dry test would show there's a problem in one of the cylinders. The wet ones will show you whether it's pistons or valves. Either way, you'd have to tear the engine apart, so, you'll find there's something wrong, yes, but the engine would have to be rebuilt either way. So it's kind of Sherlock Holmes. You find out which came first, the chicken or the egg, but you're still going to have to take the whole stupid thing apart to fix it. He says, we had a snowstorm in Maine. The road was slippery, not cleared. I hit a mailbox and a plastic under the wheel came, but the airbag popped out and went off. I have a little burn on my hand. I don't know if I can repair it because of the airbag. I'd like to because I like the car. And I have a low-income job. Yeah, it's weird. A little thing like that made the airbag go off, but there's sensors in there. They get hit right, they'll make the airbag pop, right? I don't know what the law is in Maine, but every place I've been, the law is you can only buy an airbag at a junkyard if it's been tested. There's some place to test them, right? Because they say, well, we don't want you selling used airbags. Now, on the other hand, it's your car. I don't know what the laws are there, but I knew many people in Texas that were driving around with no airbag. The airbag blew and they just took it off and they drove without an airbag. They wore their seat belts all the time. I don't know what the laws are in Maine about getting inspected. Here in Tennessee, they don't inspect anything, so it doesn't matter. Airbag goes, people just take them off and they drive them without an airbag and put their seatbelt on. That's up to you. You want to drive without an airbag and chance it. That's you got a seatbelt. They always have them for years. They work quite well if you buckle them in, right? So you have to find the laws of where you are. I don't know what the laws are in Maine. I know most states, they've got all kinds of real strict laws about selling used airbags. Osama 416 says, should I buy this Ford Expedition? I'm thinking about a 2012 Expedition, excellent shape. It has about 50,000 miles on it. It's a good choice. I currently have a GX 470 Lexus with 450,000 kilometers. It's been good for the past 3 years. But I'm bored and I want to try something new but close to reliability. What do you think? Don't buy that Expedition. If you've been driving a Lexus SUV, they're reliable, they're great cars. You can't compare them to the Fords. The Fords break down, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times as much. I'd say get yourself another Lexus, or if you want to spend a little bit less, get a Toyota SUV. You're used to quality that lasts a long time. I would not go into a Ford. The Expeditions, people buy them. They want a big luxury vehicle, and sometimes they'll go 100,000 or more with hardly any problems, right? But then they become endless money pits as they age. The Ford electronics break down, the transmissions break down, and it's not a good idea to buy an old, used luxury American car because they generally fall apart as they age. Look at the Toyotas and Lexuses instead if you want to buy something new. Big D says, my 2000 Xterra has a belt squeal and a warm startup. 2000 Nissan Xterra, 144,000 miles. The belt squeals mostly on warm startups. Then it stops. But it's getting worse. What could it be? All right, well, those things are pretty well made. I had an Xterra up here the other day, had 465,000 miles on it. It still ran good. You want to figure out what the squeal is. It could be as simple as one of the belts is just worn. That's such a simple thing. It'll probably fix it. If not, then what you do is when it's squealing, get yourself an electronic stethoscope and stick it on different parts to hear where the squeal's coming from. But from my experience of those fan belts, you'll probably find the noise will go away. If it doesn't, it could be an alternator that's wearing all kinds of stuff. And if it did with new belts, then like I say, you get an electronic stethoscope. You can buy them for $40 on Amazon. Put it on different parts and hear which one is squealing. If it's the alternator, when you put on the alternator, you'll hear it squeal more. But it's probably just the belt. Lamar Spear 1 says, my odometer doesn't work. Everything else does, including the speedometer. How can I fix it? Well, sad but true. You're going to have to replace the dash unit. If your speedometer works, that means the speed sensor on your transmission is working, the wiring going to the dash is working, but your odometer itself has broken. You're going to find the only way you can do it is by replacing the dash. That's broken and nobody fixes them. Now, back in the day, when I was living in Houston, there were nice speedometer shops. And I would take the dash out, I'd give it to a speedometer shop, they would fix the odometer and bring it back. But that's because those were mechanical odometers. Now they're digital. I don't know anybody who fixes them. And if you can find a place that fixes them, great. Maybe you can find some computer nerd shop that will fix it. Great. If not, your only alternative is to buy a super expensive dash, or go to a junkyard and buy a used one and put them in. Like I said, hardly anybody will even mess with those things anymore. They just replace the whole unit. And that's a lot of money. Do you really want to do that for an odometer? I wouldn't. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.